Hello, this is a recap of St. Anselm's Ontological Argument. The idea behind this video is to help point to a couple common mistakes that students often make, and to hopefully correct those mistakes before they set in. Alright, let's look at the ontological argument again. Premise 1, God is something than which nothing greater can be conceived. Premise 2, when we understand something, that thing exists in our understanding. So, premise 3, God, as something than which nothing greater can be conceived, exists in our understanding. 4, but if God really is something than which nothing greater can be conceived, then God must not only exist in our understanding, but he must also exist in reality, because if God didn't also exist in reality, then there'd be something greater, namely, the being that existed both in our understanding and reality. And this is a contradiction. So, God exists both in our understanding and in reality. Now, when we're thinking about this argument and we're trying to figure out what is even going on with it, why does it work, what's the point? Well, I'd like to draw our attention to the first premise. God is something than which nothing greater can be conceived. So, in this argument, it's this first premise which defines God as something than which nothing greater can be conceived that does the work. As we'll see as we move through this video, it's the nothing greater part that's really moving this argument forward. Now, you might think that what the argument is saying is that if we can conceive or think of something, then this thing must exist in reality, right? I mean, isn't that what's happening? Like, we can conceive of this idea of God, and so God exists in reality, right? But notice that the argument doesn't, in fact, say this, right? The first three premises of the argument, God is something than which nothing greater can be conceived. When we understand something, that thing exists in our understanding. So God is something than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in our understanding, is just enough to put this concept of God in our understanding, right? And you remember that I said that it's the nothing greater can be conceived part that's doing the work in the argument, and we see this in premise 4. If God really is something than which nothing greater can be conceived, then God must not only exist in our understanding, but he must also exist in reality, because if God didn't also exist in reality, there'd be something greater, namely the thing that existed both in our understanding and in reality, right? And this, of course, leads to our conclusion. So, rather than thinking that what the argument is saying, that if something exists in our understanding, it must exist in reality, instead what it's saying is when we understand something, that thing exists in our understanding, okay? We can understand what we hear. I understand what you're talking about when you use the word unicorn, even if we don't believe that this thing that's being talked about exists. So I don't actually believe that unicorns exist, right? But I can still understand what you're talking about if you tell me a story about a unicorn. Notice that in this example, a unicorn and I, right, are similar to the fool and God. Similar, but not identical. However, according to Anselm, when we understand what we hear, this thing exists in our understanding. So because I understand the word unicorn, the idea of a unicorn exists in my understanding. Now look, this is a lot different than saying that a unicorn exists in reality. But here's the weird part, because the argument does seem to be saying that God exists in reality, right? And in my understanding. So what's going on? Well, it's the fourth premise that moves God from existing just in my understanding to existing both in my understanding and reality. And this is the fourth premise, probably the most confusing part of the argument. But if God really is something than which nothing greater can be conceived, then God must not only exist in our understanding, but he must also exist in reality, because if God didn't also exist in reality, there'd be something greater, namely the being that existed both in our understanding and in reality, and this is a contradiction. It's God's greatness, following from the way that God is defined in the first premise, that makes God exist in both our understanding and reality. All right? Now look, this may seem a little bit weird. In fact, it probably seems a lot weird. Okay? It may seem like God suddenly existed because of the way that we define the word God. Okay? And we might not like this. But as far as this argument goes, there's a sense in which this understanding is right. And it leads to a way that we can object to the argument. All right. Let's look at an argument I like to call Nick's ontological argument for the perfect Big Mac. By the perfect Big Mac, we mean a Big Mac than which none greater can be conceived, which I've shortened there to BMTWNGCBC. Premise 2, if we understand what it means to speak of something, then that thing exists in our understanding. Okay. So, the perfect Big Mac exists in our understanding. Fair enough. But, if the perfect Big Mac really is a Big Mac than which none greater can be conceived, then the perfect Big Mac must not just exist in our understanding, but it must also exist in reality. Because if the perfect Big Mac didn't also exist in reality, there would be a Big Mac more perfect, right? Namely, the Big Mac that did exist both in our understanding and in reality. So, the perfect Big Mac exists both in our understanding and in reality. Awesome. Awesome. But look, this argument is obviously absurd. As much as I love it deeply, it's an absurd argument. But it seems to show that you can end up with a Big Mac, both in your understanding and in reality, if you understand the Big Mac as great enough. Okay? So this points to a possible problem with the structure of the ontological argument. It seems to make the ontological argument able to make any kind of object exist if we define the object as great enough. So in the original example, the original version of this objection to the ontological argument, the person who was objecting was talking about an island. So imagine an island greater than an island so great. An island than which none greater can be conceived, right? And then following from understanding this island, the island must exist in the same way that my Big Mac exists. And as I mentioned, this problem was raised to Anselm. His response was that God is greater than all other kinds of objects, right? And so because of this, the ontological argument only works with God. Now, to be fair, this is not a very good retelling of Anselm's reply. It's just sort of a very quick overview, but this is effectively what he said. And so I'll leave it to you to decide if this is a good response to this objection. So I hope that this video helped clarify some of the conclusion or some of the confusion with the ontological argument. If you have any more questions, please feel free to ask. Thanks a lot.